Everybody loves a good deal, and unsurprisingly, us miniature fanatics are no exception to this. With Games Workshop prices on the rise and excess money becoming more and more uncommon, it's no surprise that some people will go to extreme lengths to make sure they get the best prices on all of their minis. Now here in the UK, it's not that hard to get around 20% off most Games Workshop kits, with most brick and mortar stores and online retailers offering such discounts, but this isn't always the case overseas. However, one area that these discounts don't apply to is the coveted kits from Forge World. Forge World not only offers some amazing looking minis that you can use in your Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar armies, as well as a whole range of Middle-earth stuff, but they are also the sole place that you can purchase those oh so tempting Horus Heresy miniatures. With the Horus Heresy being a series that is near and dear to many people's hearts, it's no surprise that they'd want to own their very own Space Marine legions. But with Forge World's lack of discounts and high prices, many are left feeling as though Forge World simply charge way too much for these models. And this has led to the development of what can be considered the elephant in the room for the hobby industry: recasters. Today, I thought I'd take some time to take a look at the recasting industry and whether these cheaper prices really are worth any negatives that they might entail. So kick back, grab a brew, and relax as we take a brief dive into the world of recasting. First of all, I should probably explain what I mean when I talk about recasting. When it comes to recasting miniatures, it's when someone takes a model produced by a person or company and makes a mold of said model, then uses that mold to produce their own unofficial versions of those miniatures. Now, this isn't a video about companies that produce miniatures heavily inspired by other settings, as generally there's actually a decent amount of work that goes into those, not only in the design aspect, but the quality of the product is normally pretty good, and generally speaking, they're really good value for money. Broadly speaking, there are two reasons why someone might make recasts of another company or person's miniatures. The first major reason why someone may recast miniatures is due to the original miniature no longer being available. Be it due to companies going bust or lines being relaunched and redone, there's eventually going to come a time when a miniature will simply no longer be available in the hobby community. But that does not stop us miniature addicts from wanting to get our grubby little mitts on such minis. This leads to people recasting the minis so that they can fill this demand. While without the permission from the original producer, this is still technically breaking the law. This is generally looked upon more favourably by the community because they're simply helping to keep the coveted miniature in circulation. However, this does start to become an issue if the original miniature is part of a limited run, as this leads to the recreations becoming fraudulent, and therefore people end up buying miniatures that are considered fakes, something which isn't good for the community at all. The second major reason why people may recast miniatures is due to either a high price tag or limited availability. Now, this is generally the case that we see when it comes to Games Workshop and Forge World miniatures due to the expensive price tag associated with them. Recasters are able to produce and sell these miniatures for significantly less than Games Workshop do, and this leads to many turning to recasters to buy said minis. However, this practice can be seen as quite malicious, as it's taking money away from companies that are actively producing the miniatures. Much like the previous reason for recasting miniatures, this is considered illegal if you do not have the original producer's permission. Now, recasting as a whole has been around for a long time, but when it comes to miniatures, the first instances that I was able to find date back all the way to 1995. Back in the 90s, Games Workshop was a much smaller company, with 2nd edition only being released in 1993 and Forge World as we know it not yet created. Sometime in the mid-90s, Games Workshop issued a license to a company by the name of Mike Biasi Studios to produce 25mm scale Warhammer models based off their Epic range. Unfortunately for Mike, however, around 1995 he also began to suffer with health issues related to the resin he was using, and thus had to stop producing miniatures. A short while later, also in 1995, a new company by the name of Forge World Models, surprisingly not that one, also received a license to produce Games Workshop models, including those produced by Mike Biasi. However, even though the rights of those models were owned by Games Workshop, Forge World Models never actually received permission from Mike himself, meaning that to produce his models, they had to make their own molds, as they didn't own the master copies. This led to Forge World's productions of Mike's models suffering from the same issues that we see in the poorer quality recasts of today. If you want to learn some more about this, make sure to check out the episode of Codex Compliant linked in the description down below. And shout out to Snipe and Wib for not only doing all the research for this on my part, but also allowing me to use their wonderfully crafted footage. Thanks guys, you're the best. A short 3 years later, Forge World Models stopped producing miniatures, and the Forge World as we know today was announced in the White Dwarf issue of October 1998, a statement that is not at all confusing. While the recasting of Games Workshop miniatures might have taken place prior to 1995, generally speaking there's not much documentation around these sorts of things, as you know it's kind of illegal. So this is actually the first documented case that I was kind of able to find in regards to recasting. Seeing as these days Games Workshop is a much larger company and actually takes action against those that recast their miniatures, you're not going to find much more online in the way of an official history behind companies that have and haven't sold recasts of miniatures. So a brief history lesson out the way, Let's move on to the reasons why people might buy some Recast and the various positives and negatives associated with those. The first major reason why people may buy Recast is due to the high cost of the original model. Now, in territories like the UK and the US, we're pretty lucky with the price of Games Workshop kits. But when it comes to places like New Zealand and Australia, the high price of Games Workshop kits alone, let alone Forge World kits, is enough to price many out of the hobby. Thus, this has created an ample market for recasters. Due to the cheaper prices that these recasters are able to offer, it suddenly makes the hobby a lot more affordable to many people, and thus that is the reason why many people will choose to buy recasts over official Games Workshop kits. The second major reason that people may buy recasts is what I'm dubbing perceived cost. Now, this is how much people believe that it costs companies like Games Workshop or Forge World to actually produce the minis versus how much they choose to sell them for. Now, rather unsurprisingly, Games Workshop doesn't really publish how much it costs them to produce, each individual Cadian soldier or Space Marine or each Smaug, so we don't really know what the markup is of these, but generally speaking, people assume that it is a lot cheaper than what they sell the boxes for. In many cases, this leads to people perceiving that Games Workshop simply charges too much for these models, be it due to shipping prices in their region or just the raw cost of the kits. Thus, they will turn to recasters. Now, this is different from the previous reason that people buy recasters, as they're able to afford the original kits. They just choose to purchase from recasters because it is so much cheaper, over flat out being unable to afford the price of the Forge World or Games Workshop kits in their region. Finally, the third major reason that people are likely to buy from recasts is availability. Now, this is where things such as either limited kits come in, or the fact that companies have run out of stock. Sometimes people just really want a model, and unfortunately for whatever reason they missed out either on the original run, or they just happen to be out of stock at the moment in time that they want to order the kit. And in cases where people either can't or don't want to wait, they will turn to recasters to get their hands on such models. The original miniature might also be out of production due to companies going under or, range being refreshed. And the prices on places like eBay might just be too expensive, so people will turn to recasters in the hopes to find these long lost models. Now, I just want to preface this section with the fact that whilst I in no way endorse or encourage people to go out and buy recasts, at the end of the day, I really couldn't care where you get your miniatures from. All I care about at the end of the day is that you are having the most fun in the hobby that you possibly can. And if this means that you have to turn to recasters to get a hold of some of the miniatures, so be it, you do you. At the end of the day, these are all just little plastic figurines that we love to paint up, play, and just take part in this community. So as long as everyone around you is having fun, it really doesn't matter where you get the minis from. Now, it's all well and good me saying all this stuff, but how am I to actually know what recasts are like without obtaining some? Well, luckily, I know a couple of people who have bought recasts in the past that were kind enough to lend me the models for this video. So I went out and picked up the Forge World official version of the Contemptor Dreadnaught, as well as them lending me a recast version of the Contemptor Dreadnaught, along with a couple of other word bearers gubbins, so I could compare them for you. So let's jump to the desk. So here I have the official word bearers Contemptor Dreadnaught that I picked up naturally from Forge World. As you can see, it's still completely sealed and everything. And here is the box of models that I borrowed from my friend who picked up some recasts. So he also happens to play word bearers, which is naturally why we're friends. So he's given me the bodies that he picked up, or the torsos that you can use for your marines, along with one of the packs of heads, one of the packs of shoulder pads, and naturally the Contemptor Dreadnaught itself. So let's get these open and take a look at the resin. So first of all, you can see that there's quite a clear color difference between the Forge World resin and the Recast resin, because they're using a different kind of resin. But the resin itself, it definitely, I would say it feels cheaper. Like, I've handled resin from all sorts of companies, and you can definitely, I think you can just feel like a sort of cheapness to this. But I mean, it's to be expected. The model itself is supposedly cheaper than the official Games Workshop cast. But let's whip out the Forge World one, and then we can do a nice direct comparison. So here we have the official Forge World one. So the resin definitely feels different, if that kind of makes sense. You can get the two and compare them side by side. The quality, there is definitely a difference, especially when you get nice and up close. You can kind of see, but the recast one has not got as smooth a line. There's some chipping there when compared to the original. On top of that, the insignia that's used to kind of denote the fact that it is a word bearer Dreadnaught, it just looks a lot cleaner. on the Forge World model when you compare it to the Recast. Like, the edges of this one seem a lot rougher, and you can tell this wasn't done from a original mold, because you can kind of see symptoms of a slightly lower quality cast than if you were to compare it to a Forge World cast. Again, if you kind of compare the bottom of the feet, again you can see it's kind of rougher when you directly compare them. Like, again, where you can tell it's come from a different kind of mold than the original, compared to the cleanness of the Forge World mold. You get the insignia side by side, and you can see that, you know, it's not the worst job in the world, as this is seemingly one of the higher quality recasts you can get out there. But the Forge World one certainly looks a lot cleaner to the naked eye when it comes to the lines, if not on camera, than with the Recast one. And on top of that, if you notice the little metal disc there are actually some casting imperfections on this one when you compare it to the actual Forge World one. So you can see how much kind of cleaner the circle is and the different ball bearing stroke studs are there. Whereas when you take a close look at this one, you can see kind of the roughness of the circle there and where it's kind of spilled over a little bit, along with how that one is a lot less clearly defined than when you compare it to the Forge World one, which again is what you'd expect with recasts, as some of the detail is going to be lost, but in the respect of it's not as prominent or as noticeable as the official model when you compare it to the Recast. So you see on the Forge World piece here, so there are little rivets on each corners of this metal lining on this armor joint, and this detail is actually very, very faint on the Recast piece. Like, it definitely doesn't come up on camera, and it kind of barely comes out to the naked eye. It's one of those things that you can feel it if you run your finger over it, but if you were looking at the model, I think even with a dot of paint on it, it just doesn't look as anywhere near defined as it does on the official cast. So this is a look at one of the bigger pieces when it comes to recasting. So you can see, you know, it's not the worst when it comes to recasting bigger models. I mean, I know for one, I certainly prefer the official cast, but I also got them to lend me some of the smaller pieces like you saw earlier with the heads and shoulder pads and the like, because it's probably going to be a lot easier to get a decent cast of a larger model than compared to some of the smaller, more intricate models. But let's switch to the heads, shoulder pads and torsos and see how they look. So these are alternate torsos that you would use when making the models. Again, you can kind of see that the detailing isn't bad, but it's definitely really rough. It's clear this is obviously a feature that is characteristic of recast resin, where you can see that it translates, but it is a lot rougher. I'm not sure whether it's something that just, you know, a good paint job would fix or paint would be able to hide, but certainly when you're looking at the naked model, you can definitely tell there is a difference in quality. If you take a look there, that is actually one of the scrolls that was meant to be hanging off this armor plate, and you can kind of see it on camera, but it is just mangled beyond all repair. Like, that's one way you're just going to have to flat out snip it off and either model it on yourself or just kind of make it look like that detail wasn't there in the first place, which is a problem that if you do get it on the rare occasion from an official Games Workshop resin model, you could just contact customer support and I'm sure they'd happily send you out a replacement for it. So when we take a look at these shoulder pads, they're rough. This is what I'm on about when it comes to recasts not being that good quality. I mean, the Burning Book insignia of the Word Bearers, that's come out, you know, reasonably well. Again, rougher than any of the Forge World details that I can clearly tell. But just look at the edges of these, where the edge just looks ridiculously kind of rough. I mean, you could probably turn it into battle damage, but it's just not a very clean cast. And I mean, that's what you get when you end up buying recasts in that respect. It's nowhere near kind of as clean as the original when it comes to these sorts of details. The heads. So again, it's the sort of thing of, you know, they're passable. Like, some of the etching has come out reasonably well, but again, it's just rougher. Like, you can see the roughness of the lines on the raised area of the helmets here. You can see the roughness on the connecting tubes. Like, a lot of this stuff is just, you can tell it's a lower quality than official Games Workshop stuff. It's certainly not the worst quality I've ever handled. I'm gonna happily tell you that much. But just looking at all the smaller bits here that we've got, it really does seem like The bigger models, if you go with recasts, they're not the worst, but you will still lose a lot of the kind of more intricate details that are going to help bring those models to life. But when you actually get down to the smaller, that is when recasts really start to show how bad they are. I mean, looking at this and looking at the official Forge World stuff, I really don't mind paying a little bit extra for the Forge World models, just because there's so much more degree of quality and a more guarantee of quality, and there's a customer support to reach out to if things go wrong, wherever with recasters you don't have any of those guarantees. But that was a look at some of the recasts that I was able to borrow from a friend to compare to official Forge World casts, so let's just get back to the rest of the video. The positives and negatives behind recasting. So this is the fun section where I pretty much preach why I'm against recasting as the practice, so do bear in mind my kind of bias on these. But I did try to kind of critically think about all the reasons that I might find in regards to positives and negatives, as well as obviously the experience that you just saw with the desk cam. So yeah, I bear that in mind, but it is going to come across as very, I hate recasting. Now, the only real positive that I could find to recasting was the fact that it saves you money. Recasts generally cost around half the price of the official kit, all depending on the model's size. So this helps make the hobby so much more accessible to so many people, or just simply helps people get more models for their money. Now, while I'm all for making the hobby more accessible, because I want to see as many people in it as possible, I just personally feel that there are better ways that you can go about doing this. In fact, I think that a lot of people forget, and is quite important to remember, is that Games Workshop consider their models a luxury product. And I mean, it's true. You don't need minis to survive as much as it might feel like that you do, so they're well within their right to charge so much for a product. Just like the way that people charge hundreds and thousands of pounds for designer jeans and that sort of thing. The beauty of Games Workshop being a company is the fact that at the end of the day, we the consumer have some power and some say in how they price their models. If you think Games Workshop is charging too much for their models, then make yourself known. And not just on social media, write them letters. Send them emails. You know, it might feel like they're this big faceless corporate entity, but at the end of the day, there are people on the other end that do care, and there are people that do care that people are enjoying the hobby, they find it affordable, they find it fun. So make yourself known to them. And if enough people do that, then we're likely to see change, as Games Workshop is going to want to keep customers at the end of the day over lose them, because it's a lot easier to keep a customer than it is to create a brand new customer. As for the negatives of recasts, well, there are several. First of all is the lower quality of the miniatures. Now, seeing as recasters don't have access to the actual master molds most of the time, this leads to them creating a mold of an already molded product, which basically means a lot of the time you lose some of the detail. Now, quality on the recast is going to vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, so a lot of the time, in some cases, the quality is going to be a lot worse from one company than from another company. It's all just kind of a gamble that you take when you choose to buy recasts. And I mean, personally, at the end of the day, I would much rather pay a little bit more. I guess double isn't a little bit more, but I'd rather pay more and get a guaranteed good quality product with a customer service that I can actually talk to and I know are going to fix my issues, than a company that either doesn't have a customer service or one that I'm just, diving in blind with and giving money in the hopes for an actual decent usable model. Another negative of recasts is the fact that it is a malicious practice. By buying from these recasters, we risk not only legitimizing them, but kind of encouraging them to not only continue to take root in the community, but expand into other companies' products in the search of more profits, which can really hurt smaller companies. And this leads on to the third major negative that I find of recasts, the fact that it has an impact on smaller companies. Although it by no means justifies recasting as a practice, at the end of the day, Games Workshop likely doesn't feel too much of an impact from recasters. They're a big enough company now and seem to be making enough money that losing sales here or there from recasters likely doesn't really impact their profits, let alone their bottom line. However, this recasting does become an issue when it comes to smaller companies. With smaller hobby companies, it's important to express how much every single sale matters to them. Especially these one-person studios that are making these amazing bust pieces or statuette pieces that they put so much time and effort into that they likely see a decent return on, but it all depends on just how well known they're as a company. At this point, Games Workshop is a household name, but these smaller companies are very much not. So not only do they just have to fight to be noticed in the first place, but when it comes to their prices, they have to make sure it's priced nice and competitively so that people will actually consider their company over another company. This often leads to these companies running on very small budgets, making just enough to keep operating every year, unless they somehow get extremely lucky. But I mean, especially in a climate like at the minute when there's been no trade shows on, where a lot of these smaller companies see most of their business for the year come from, every sale really does matter to them. A good month of sales or a good convention can help keep the company operating for many more months than it would have otherwise. I mean, I can't express enough. Every sale really does matter to these smaller companies. The moral question. It might surprise you to find that the recasting industry is actually quite a controversial topic within the hobby community. Some groups feel like Games Workshop simply charges way too much for their models, or are starting to charge way too much for their models, so they're completely justified in turning to recasts to get a hold of their miniatures. Others, however, worry about the impact that it has on the hobby community as a whole, as well as smaller companies, and so are completely against the practice. I mean, personally, I find at the end of the day, it all boils down to your own moral compass. So now we've reached the part where I give my 2 cents on the whole issue, even though I have been injecting it at little points here and there throughout the video. So you're welcome to click off the video here if you're not interested, but remember, before you do, like and subscribe. For me, it doesn't come down to whether Games Workshop does or doesn't feel the impact of recasters on their bottom line. It comes down to the impact that it has on the smaller companies within our community. Games Workshop aren't the only victims of recasting. While taking a look at recasts for this video, I found recasts from a ton of other companies out there that are a lot smaller than Games Workshop that I know for a fact that sales really do matter to them. So it's not just the big guy that's getting picked on by these companies, the little guy is getting picked on too. Designers put hours of their lives into designing these miniatures and lack the budget of Games Workshop to produce them at such a mass scale. So at the end of the day, every sale really does matter to them. Companies that produce busts are particular victims of this because due to the sheer size of them, many will make them in limited runs, making them prime targets for recasters because people do just sometimes want to get their hands on these beautiful busts. And it's certainly not the fault of the designers that they can't make more of them. They take a financial risk whenever they choose to produce them that they're just not going to sell. So they have to be very smart and savvy about how many they choose to produce of each run. See, I feel like by purchasing recasts of Games Workshop miniatures, we risk not only legitimizing these companies, but encourage them to expand into smaller companies' ranges in the search of more profits. I completely understand the reasons that people choose to buy recasts. Not everyone is in a great financial situation, nor does everyone want to spend so much money on all of their miniatures. And I mean, all power to you if you choose to buy recasts. All I'm asking is that at the end of the day, next time you go to pick up some recast minis, maybe think about the little guy and how your decisions might impact them over just how they might impact Games Workshop. That's what I think about recasts, but what do you think? Make sure to let me know in the comments down below. This was my brief foray into the recasting industry. Honestly, it's a topic that I find really interesting, so I guess let me know if you'd like to see some more on it, as there's definitely plenty more to kind of look into in regards to it, and I would love to produce some more videos on it. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you consider giving it a like and maybe even subscribing, as it really does help out the channel. Here is some wonderful content for your viewing pleasure, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.